going to take you through how I do high gain tones on the new Axe-FX firmware 14. The setup I have here is Logic X. I recorded 3 tracks earlier with kind of different variations on the same vibe, all metal type of riffs. One with some chords in it, one with single notes, and one that's pretty much just palm mutes. And the idea there is to hear different aspects of the amps that I'm tweaking. So the basic setup I like to do here is a gate, of course, drive, amp, and cab. Super basic, nothing crazy. No compressors, no nothing. I like to go as basic as possible because in my setup here, I'm generally recording guitars, and then I'll tweak compression and stuff after the fact in my DAW or in my rig here. So what I like to do is just do basic amp settings, and I'll take you from there. The main things you want to worry about before you do anything at all is really going to be setting your input and output levels. When I'm playing my guitar into the Axe-FX, I like to make sure I'm barely touching red, and also on the output I like to make sure that I'm never touching red, because you don't want to clip your converters, which I'm doing here. I'm going into a RME interface rather than using the Axe-FX as an interface. So I want to make sure I'm not clipping my inputs on there. I want to make sure I'm not clipping my outputs on my Axe-FX in order to get the cleanest tone possible. So I have clean DIs that I have run through the Axe-FX earlier that I'm now going to run back into the Axe-FX through the rear input, and I'm going to tweak things here in real time. What I'll do basically is take you through each one of these pages here and kind of give you a rundown on what I like to tweak, and then I'm going to do everything in real time so you can kind of see how that works. On the basic page here, the settings I like to use here are bright, of course. That'll add an instant modern vibe to your sound. I think it adds quite a bit of brightness. For whatever reason, it sounds like it tightens up the low end a little tiny bit as well. I leave my mid, bass, and treble as kind of final broad sweeps if I need it. Compression, I kind of leave that alone unless I feel it's over compressed and I want a little more dynamics. Presence, of course you're going to roll on some top end there. Depth, it's self-explanatory. On the EQ page, I leave this for final tweaks as well. I don't do anything at all. I try to leave this alone the most I can, but if for some reason I can't get what I want out of the cab, then I come back here and I'll tweak some things. Speaker, I generally will bring up some speaker drive here, kind of in the 3 or 4 area, and I think you'll recognize that sound. It's sort of, I think Deftones-y is the best way to explain it, because on a lot of their albums they'll have that really thick low end that sort of seems like it pushes the speakers. This will give you that same sort of vibe because you literally are driving the speakers. So if you go too high, it's going to sound like your speakers are distorting. But if you kind of give it a moderate setting, you can kind of get that push that really kind of makes it push out through the speakers, which I like. Your transformer low frequency and high frequencies here, I kind of eliminate the saturation that might happen with running your transformers too hard. So I'll roll this up a little bit because I don't want any junk below, maybe 80 hertz or so, or 100 hertz. So I'll kind of roll that. I'll also do the same thing with the high frequency here. Everything else I leave as is generally. Dynamics page, if I want a little bit of weight, I'll roll up the thunk. And again, I get a little, it's almost invisible because it's kind of subtle, but it adds a definite thickness to the sound that doesn't seem to eat up your mix. So I will roll this up a little bit if I want a little bit of thickness, rather than rolling up bass or even the depth knob. I'll use this one first instead. Preamp Sag, sometimes I flick it on or off. I find it's pretty subtle. Supply Sag, I rarely touch that. This whole bottom row, other than transformer drive, I really pretty much leave at the bass settings. I rarely touch them. Same thing with all this stuff up here. But transformer match, of course, as you've heard Cliff say 100 times, it's one of the most powerful features in Axe-FX. So I will roll this up a little bit if I want a little bit of warmth, but you also get a little bit of looseness, I feel, by rolling this up. But you also get a little bit of tightness and a little bit of brightness by rolling it out. but can also get harsh. So it's a double-edged sword there. But like you've heard him say, it is very, very powerful, and I will use this a little bit up front if I feel the sound is lacking. But I usually use this at the end to make sure I get the tightness or the looseness or the warmth that I want. This is certainly one of my favorite features of the Axe-FX. Power, damping, I try to keep it at a moderate setting, because if you go too high, in my opinion, you kind of get a little bit harsh as well. And I'm staying away from anything harsh, of course. Harshness will, kill any mix, so I stay away from that with great care. Presence frequency and depth frequency. Sometimes these two things here in conjunction with the cab can get you where you want to go pretty quickly. Presence frequency at 1K doesn't always work, and same with depth frequency at 200 doesn't always work. So sometimes you'll roll that down a little bit or up a little bit depending on how you're tuned. For this tune here, I'm tuned to drop A flat, so I turn the depth down slightly. Your power tube type, of course, there's lots of stuff to choose from here, and they also make a pretty subtle difference, but I think it's fairly audible in my opinion. So I will roll that around a little bit just to kind of see what it does. Got to kind of listen closely, but if you're designing sounds for a mix, listening closely is pretty much what it's all about. So I do this as final steps as well, because these are pretty much broad strokes. Power amp, low cut and high cut. If you're finding you're getting a little bit of a woofiness or a little bit of tubiness to your bottom end, I will roll this up a little bit. But the first thing I roll off is almost always the cab. And the cab, in my opinion, is the most important part of the entire setup. For this, I have just a standard 75 watt Marshall cab. But I find that if you start rolling off your low end here and your high end here, you can kind of push the amp a little bit hotter, and you won't get that harshness because you're rolling it off here at the cab. And I find you can get a little bit less harshness and a little more brightness by rolling it off here rather than on the power amp or with your standard bass treble presence settings. So this is super powerful. This will change the overall tone more drastically than any one knob in the entire amp setup. So choose carefully on this. I kind of choose the cab with an end in mind. I'll roll through several of my favorites. If you pick the right cab, it can make adjusting your amp very, very simple in most cases. So let's just roll through this. I'm going to adjust things in real time so you can see what happens. Of course, there's always CabLab if you're not getting what you want out of the stock cabs. That's a great way of blending some of your favorites and coming up with something that suits your needs. This one here is a mix by Brian Nowak. The best part about the Ultra Res cabs is they get you where you gotta go significantly faster, in my opinion. I'll leave both the before and after presets in the description below. As you can imagine, the pickups and the guitar are going to make a huge difference in the final outcome. For reference, I'm using a Skirvison Raptor 6 26.5 inch scale and bare knuckle aftermaths, which are relatively bright, so you may need to dial back in some brightness.